Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this particular session we are going to carry forward our series on inequality and difference, and we are going to talk on caste and inequality in detail. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Smriti. Dr. Smriti is Assistant Professor in Department of History, PGDAV Evening College, University of Delhi. Dr. Vip's immense experience in her own field as well as her desire to give best always help us out in understanding various topics in detail, and we believe that from today's session also we are going to grab maximum. So friends, let's welcome our guest Dr. Smriti and let's try to understand today's topic, that is caste and inequality. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
Hello Geetika. Thanks a lot for those kind words of appreciation. I'm glad we are discussing on this topic because this topic is of relevance even in contemporary times, and it is the duty of each and every citizen of India to ensure that any kind of inequality does not exist in society. So carrying forward our discussion on caste and inequality, today also we would be discussing the historical genesis of caste and caste ideologies, as we had discussed in the last lecture, as to how it was during the Vedic period, that is from 1500 BCE to 600 BCE, which roughly includes both the Rig Vedic period as well as the later Vedic period, that caste ideology kind of started evolving, and how gradually there were a number of changes that were to come about in the subsequent period. By the later Vedic period, that is around 1000 BCE, the word Varna came to incorporate not only those who were the indigenous inhabitants of the Indian subcontinent, but also it began to incorporate within this term the various inhabitants, the inhabitants who had migrated and who were part of the Aryan society. So therefore, even within the Aryan group, there emerged a number of categories, and stratification was gradually going to become deeper and deeper. Now, a famous reference to this that has been given time and again is the Purusha hymn. From this we get both a general idea of a fixed hierarchy that was going to emerge in due course of time, and also a mythological justification for that hierarchy. So the mythology went on to say that the original Purusha disintegrated into primarily 4 castes, and the 4 castes were supposed to have evolved out of different parts of the body of the Purusha, corresponding to their ritual status in society. So for example, the hymn divided people into 4 basic categories. The Brahmins or the priests were of course at the topmost hierarchy, followed by Kshatriyas or Rajanyas, who were supposed to be the warriors and the protectors of the people, and then the Vaishyas or the Vish, who were the commoners, and then lastly there were the servile ones who were supposed to serve the others. So gradually, as the Aryans were transitioning from nomadic to a settled life, and they were adopting agricultural practices, and especially with the greater use of iron and with the cutting of forests and conversion of forest areas into fields, there were now far more greater surpluses that were created over a period of time, and all these changes gradually resulted in transformation of a so-called nomadic society to a settled society, which was largely dependent on state formation and emergence of kingdoms, a tendency that became increasingly widespread from 600 BCE. Now, with this settled life and with the creation of surplus, there also emerged greater inequalities and stratification in society, because not everyone in the society was equally controlling or maintaining his or her hold over the resources. process. But still Varna was a fluid category. It was not as if there was a complete stamping of the Varna that had taken place by this time, because there are a number of references which attest to the fact that even the son of a Brahmana could be a Kshatriya and so and so forth. But there was a greater hardening of caste hierarchy as time passed, and from 800 BCE to 400 CE, that is Christian era, as polities, states, kingdoms emerged and they became stronger, and there was a greater tendency towards centralization and emergence of a larger sized kingdoms, and also as the economies became more complex and there was greater division of labor, there was greater specialization in society, the whole process became much more complex, and there was gradually emergence of jatis as occupational categories which were going to play a very important role within the Varna hierarchy. So therefore now once caste became part of the occupational category, and this identification also assumed hereditary proportions. Therefore, one can say that from 500 CE onwards, there was a further consolidation of Varna hierarchy. So, a trend that had emerged from 1500 BCE onwards had no breaks in between. In fact, the system kept on becoming more and more complex, and the ideology also kept on strengthening with each future generation. And as a result, by 500 CE, the Brahman orthodoxy made a comeback, and in fact, Buddhism and Jainism, which had emerged as powerful heterodox sects around 600 BCE, they got a temporary setback, and in fact, at some places there was, a violent overthrow of these religions, and there was a comeback and re-establishment of Brahmanical superiority. The emergence of prescriptive texts during this period called the Dharma Shastras, for example, and a number of Smritis, for example, Manu Smriti, also played a very important role in legitimizing the whole philosophy of caste system and Varna order. And therefore, caste, Varna and Jati, they became central to the whole organization of the society. And these texts also reconfigured the whole ideology of Varna in order to relate it to the notion of purity and pollution. So therefore, now it was no longer occupational or hereditary character that was important, rather the notion of purity and pollution, as to some castes being considered pure and some considered as part of Dvija, that is the twice born, whereas some considered impure, and this soon became the practice throughout the Indian subcontinent, the way society was organized. Though there were some exceptions also to these rules of caste organizations and caste hierarchization. For example, the tribal population, which was still outside the ambit of this kind of hierarchy and stratification that had emerged. Now, this also kind of reinforces the idea of Varnashram Dharam. That is, each Varna had a particular duty or dharam to perform, and it was imperative that each and every individual, to whichever caste he or she belonged, they had to perform those specific duties, and that was considered in fact as part of their spiritual and moral upliftment also, and also it was declared as part of the karmic order. So therefore it was pre-decided that the function of Kshatriyas was to rule and to be the protectors, whereas the function of the lowest caste was that they had to perform these servile functions. They had to always take care of the needs and requirements of the rest of the three varnas. So therefore, those who refused to acknowledge this system and those who refused to get bogged down by these already laid down principles and philosophies were declared as outcast, and there were a number of prescriptive texts which kind of laid down very strict rules to deal with such deviants, and most of them were not only declared outcasts but also they were publicly flogged and punished. So the same prescriptive texts, the so-called Dharma Shastras and a number of Smritis, etc., they also reinforced patriarchy, that is the subordinate position of women vis-a-vis men, and also they laid down strict rules of endogamy as well as totally banishing interdining, etc. So therefore, with this kind of an ideology that was being replicated time and time over again, there was no looking back, and the caste system became part and parcel of Indian social order. Now, soon Varna was also going to assume political power, and the way Varna was being explained also came to denote the way power was going to be exercised. So, from the very beginning, Varna and the political power came to be closely linked, because the rulers who invariably were Kshatriyas, they patronized Brahmins, and these Brahmins very often would fabricate genealogies in order to trace a rich line of ancestry. So even if a particular ruler did not really belong to the Kshatriya Varna, but because there were Brahmanas who were going to support his cause and they were going to support his antecedents, very soon genealogies would be framed, and there are so many Prashasti Patras also which attest to this fact. So therefore, all the rulers were declared over a period of time genuine Kshatriyas, even if they belonged to the other castes or subcastes, and they did not really come from the royal background. So here example of Gupta rulers can also be given, under whose patronage many of the Dharma Shastras were compiled, and most of Guptas were of Vaishya origin, that is, they did not really belong to the Kshatriya Varna, but because they were in the ruling position and they were hand in glove with the Brahmanas who were supporting their cause and therefore fabricating a number of genealogies in order to assign them, the second important position in the Varna hierarchy. So therefore, Varna ideology was quite useful for absorbing many waves of migrants and conquerors. For example, during the 6th century Hun invasion, a number of leaders of these invading tribes were given Kshatriya status, whereas rest of the population or the common, commoners who were also migrating as part of the Hun population were given a lower Varna status. So this was how even the outside influx of immigrants were also incorporated within the Brahmanical social order, and similar process was also followed for a number of forest dwellers and the tribes that were being incorporated into the Brahmanical fold, and the leaders of the tribes that were being incorporated were probably assigned a higher status as compared to rest of the tribals who were probably accorded the 4th Varna status. So here some textual references can also be given which attest to the fact as to how there were a number of prescriptive texts which were trying to define and redefine the significance of Varna order. For example, the laws of Manu, which proclaimed that in all castes, those children who are born to the wedded wives and they are equal in caste, those wives who are equal in caste to their husbands are to be considered as belonging to the same caste. So therefore, both the Anulom and the Pratilom marriages were, discussed in terms of their being legitimate or illegitimate, and those children who were born to wives who did not really belong to the same varna did not really get a ritually significant position in society. Then adultery was also prohibited, and this was primarily because it caused a mixture of castes, because if both the male and the female did not belong to same varna, and one belonged to a higher and the other belonged to the lower caste, and there the offsprings were not really given the status of the father's caste. So therefore, in order to avoid any kind of disruption of the moral fabric of society, very rigid punishments were to be accorded in a case of adultery, and this aspect I have already discussed in some of my earlier lectures when we were discussing evolution of patriarchy, and this had specially been done with reference to a number of Vedic texts. So I would request the students to go back to revert to those earlier lectures in case you are interested in finding out more about the topic. Now, carrying forward the laws of Manu and Manu Smriti, which emerged as a text which was made up of almost 2685 verses. This was a very comprehensive text which discussed religion, custom, law, politics, and approximately can be traced to the period around 1st century CE. Now, this also talks about the 4 stages of life, that is the 4 ashramas. Then it also incorporates a detailed reference to a detailed description of the caste system, the evolution of caste system, the 4 aims of life, and also it talks in detail about the status of women, which also I have already discussed. Now, coming to the aspect of religion and how religion can be related directly or indirectly to the hardening of caste hierarchy is also quite relevant for our discussion. Here again one can give reference to dismemberment of Purusha, which can be understood, which can be deciphered from the Purusha hymn which I have just mentioned. So the hymn mentions that how different varnas, they emerged out of the body of Purusha. So from the head it was from the head or the mouth it was the Brahmana, because they were the superior most caste. So therefore they came out from the purest part of the body, and they were probably assigned white color. Then arms or the Kshatriyas, they were the rulers and the protectors, and they were assigned red color. So therefore Varna here also meant the color, as well as the characteristic of purity and pollution was also being attached to the whole idea of caste. And then from the legs it was the Vaishyas, who were going to perform various functions as landlords or as businessmen or as active members of society, who were going to take care of the production process, and they were probably assigned the brown color. And the last caste, which was the servile caste, which was supposed to perform the menial jobs, they can also be considered as partly belonging to the peasant folk, and they were assigned the black color. So therefore, with this kind of hierarchy emerging in a number of religious texts, and a lot of legitimacy therefore was granted to the evolving Varna system over a period of time. Now, another example of religious texts which attested to this kind of social division in society, for example, one can talk about Bhagavad-Gita, which again gave a basis for, which again kind of strengthened or championed the cause of the caste system. So the works of Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas and other castes were considered as different, and no one caste could perform the function of the other caste, and in fact it was considered very important to have harmony in society, and that harmony could only happen if each and every varna was performing their duties dutifully without interfering in the other varnas functions. So the works of a Brahman were declared as peace, and purity and austerity as well as harmony. Loving, forgiveness, and all these natures were also characteristic of a person were also described with reference to the varna that they belong to. So wisdom, faith, vision, righteousness, uprightness, all these were the qualities that were associated with the Brahmins. Then similarly, Kshatriya were described as the heroic, having inner fire, consistency, a drive to do something, courageous in battlefield, and having qualities of a noble leadership. Then Gita further describes Vaishya Varna as largely being involved in trade, agriculture, rearing of cattle as being there, as being prime importance as far as their occupation was concerned. And then the lowest caste service was of course, the lowest caste's work was of course service, and that too unquestionable service. And only if each and every varna performed their duties well, they could think of having a better life in future births. So the whole karma theory was also kind of associated in order to justify the continuation of these inequalities in society. Now, having discussed the trend that was prevalent during the ancient period, as one evolves further, and one can talk about the early medieval period or the Mughal period. So from 8th century onwards, when Indians came in contact with the Muslims, and the encounter with Islam from between 8th to 11th centuries was gradually going to have a lot of influence on Indian society and also on the emerging caste inequalities. The new rulers, of course, did not accept the hierarchical ideology that was prevalent in the Indian subcontinent, because they had their own views on the way society was to be organized, and there was no caste system per se in Islam. But Varna continued to remain an important component of political power at local levels, and the influence and importance of the upper castes could not be negated well into 18th century, when finally the colonial rule came to be established. From 1757 onwards, we have the establishment of the control of English East India Company as a result of Battle of Plassey, and soon the area of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa was going to be under their influence. And since the Britishers introduced their ideas, values over, of course, the colonial society, so there were some changes that were bound to occur. Though I would be discussing in a separate lecture as to how even colonial ideology played on the card of caste, and the way they described Indian society was largely going to be based on their understanding or their interpretation of traditional Indian texts. A number of prescriptive texts also became part of references even for the British administrators. So I would be going back to this issue in one of the future lectures, but for right now, let me just bring to you this idea that with the establishment of British rule, there was bound to be a change in the way politics was incorporated in the caste hierarchy, because of course the Britishers were not part of this fourfold Varna system, and neither they were supporters of any system that was to be based on this fourfold Varna division. And the colonial construction of caste system had largely originated because of their desire to know more and more about Indian society. It was not in order to further establish their links with this kind of a Varna ideology or to re-establish Varna ideology, but just to understand the way Indian society was organized and how they could mobilize more and more support for themselves. So therefore, in due course of time, British rule helped in evolving the present discourse on caste and ideology, and also in understanding the caste system. The British administrators and scholars called Orientalists, they represented caste as fundamentally different from other hierarchical systems like race, etc. And they also understood caste only from Brahmanical textual sources, that is basically Dharam Shastras, and therefore they came to ascribe a specific Hindu kind of a religious ordering to the whole notion of caste system, and they even attempted the othering of the colonized, projecting them as exotic, different, and most important, in need of Western enlightened rule. So one hidden agenda that Britishers had while trying to describe Indian society as largely caste ridden and largely, being exploitative towards the lower castes was primarily to prove to the world that how much important it was for them to rule over a backward and ignorant country like India, because only their rule could be benevolent, only they could bring about modernization and genuine upliftment of the lower castes and the exploited orders, whether it was the lower castes or it was the marginalized sections like women, etc. So therefore, with this kind of hidden agenda, they kept on trying to justify, and they kept on trying to unearth newer and older caste ideologies that had been existing. And it was ultimately in 1833 that British declared that no person on account of religion, place of birth, descent or color would be disabled from holding any office of employment. Now this was going to be a great leveler, and this coming as part of a policy statement was also going to influence the future course of action. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this productive session. Friends, you are requested to be with us as we are back after a short break, and we are going to give you more insightful inputs to the topic. Till then, keep watching us. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on caste and inequality. Through the previous session, we tried to give you the maximum knowledge. Friends, taking the session forward, we are going to talk on the topic more, and for the discussion we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Bibb. Dr. Shruti Bibb is Assistant Professor in Department of History, PGDAV, Evening College. So let's welcome our guest, Dr. Bibb, and let's try to gain maximum through her. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
Hello Geetika. Thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity. So students, we were discussing as to how the colonial period began a trend whereby there was a further justification and a further reification of the already existing caste system. And one such trend that emerged and which strengthened this procedure, which further legitimized this whole idea of caste system, was the census. So, a number of policies and a number of laws that were based on the idea of caste hierarchy, census and elections can be considered as important milestones in this regard. For example, they reinforced the idea of caste, made it a lived reality for Indians, and the colonial education further taught this notion of the caste system to Indians as they were incorporating these discussions as part of not only history lessons but also a number of other subjects. So therefore, soon caste began to be reified as well as labeled. So there was now a greater scope of further strengthening of the already existing caste system and caste ideologies, which earlier there was this kind of a written labeling and a record maintaining and gathering of data earlier was absent, which now became more and more institutionalized. So therefore, soon there emerged certain categories of castes like the criminal castes or the martial castes. The idea that certain characteristics could be ascribed to certain castes was further strengthened, and it was further legitimized by the colonial administration, because in order to employ particular kind of population in the army, the population who would not, the people who would not only be loyal but also will be strong, will be sturdier, they would be hardy enough, and they would also be belonging to a particular kind of a moral fabric, was floated, and therefore certain castes began to be considered as martial and certain castes were declared as not being fit for employment in army. So probably they did not come under this category of martial caste. So they could not really be depended on, or they could not be really be relied on, and this tendency became all the more strong after the revolt of 1857, because the British administration had suffered a major jolt once there had been mutiny in the army, and so many Indian soldiers had risen against the British policies and the officers. So therefore, there was a genuine concern regarding the quality of people that were being employed in army, and therefore with this kind of bracketing and this kind of labeling, the work of employment in army assumed particular proportions and characteristics. So therefore, patriarchy was also reinforced, and largely on account of believing that Dharma Shastras were largely religious texts. So Dharma Shastras were justified as the important reference points and as religious texts. So therefore, the so-called religious people of India were expected to abide by the rules and moral injunctions laid down in the Dharma Shastras. Overall, this tendency of not only gathering data on the basis of caste and then compiling the data and then putting it in the public domain, overall this created a much more fixity, and fixity not only in ideas but also in practices around the Varna Jati model social order, and it completely overlooked the fluidity that had existed in the past. So, colonialism definitely further rigidified and further kind of legitimized the already existing caste system, and the issue of rights, however, was one major change that came about as a result of beginning of colonial kind system of education and spreading English language, English becoming the medium of instruction, and basically replacement of the indigenous system of education with the colonial models of education. This had a far-reaching implication on the issue of rights, which was now going to be raised by the marginalized groups of Indian society, because with this changing trend and with the opening up of the public offices to all categories and classes and castes of Indians, there was no looking back now, and the marginalized sections of society began questioning as to how and why for so long they had been kept away from public office. So paradoxically, it can be said that colonialism also created a narrow space for the articulation of rights, and these rights were largely going to be demanded by the lower caste groups. Attempts at creating a systematic ordering of all jatis into the same varna led to thousands of petitioning challenging colonial ordering. So therefore, now there was a different kind of caste ideology that was emerging during the colonial period. Now there was an attempt to get oneself identified with a particular caste, okay, so that the kind of notion that was attached to a particular caste, it could benefit. For example, now there were so many jatis which wanted to be included as part of the martial castes, because that would help them gain access to employment in the colonial army. Then some jatis also claimed a higher varna system based on the purity of their customs, and often this also included the greater seclusion of and restrictions upon women of these jatis, because it was considered that women of upper castes, they lead very secluded lives. They are not really outside into the public domain. So therefore, this was considered as a very important stepping stone, this kind of a lifestyle which would relegate women to the domestic sphere. It would add some respectability to them, and this kind of a shift from a public to a private domain would automatically, facilitate their movement into a higher jati, higher varna. So therefore, with this kind of ideological change that was going to come about, patriarchy, rather than getting weakened, further got strengthened, and in fact a number of marginalized castes which earlier used to give much more freedom and movement was there for their women folk, now gradually started imposing a number of restrictions on the movement of their women folk in order to enjoy a higher ritual status in the hierarchy, because the higher varnas or the higher jatis, they never used to let their women move about freely in search of employment or such vocations. So therefore, this was again a two-way process. Paradoxically, it resulted in demand for greater rights by those women, by those castes which had remained marginalized and which, in the past had not really enjoyed the fruits of their labor. So they now became more and more vocal, they became more and more mobilized and also organized. But on the other hand, there was a tendency also towards Sanskritization, whereby the lower castes started aping the ways and means of the upper castes in order to gain access to a higher ritual Varna status. Here one can also give examples of some very important leaders who emerged, and they were going to play a very important role in mobilizing change within the society. For example, Jyotiba Phule. Now, Jyotiba Phule's Satya Shodhak Samaj attacked the very foundation of the hierarchical principle of caste. Now, this was going to be a major entry point to a number of caste movements that were going to take place, and the way people belonging to the marginalized sections of society were going to become more vocal and demanding for fulfillment of their demands and aspirations. Now, this encouraged creation of supra-local identities. Now, this is a very important change that came about from 19th century onwards, and this was based on colonial understanding of Varna Jati, but different from the much more localized sense of identity that had been earlier the case. So, before the coming in of Britishers, the very identification of a person was more rooted around local conditions. The community, the local area, the local territory was going to be the deciding factor for his or her identity into some kind of a community network. But with the onset of a number of changes that had come about, new kind of education system, new means of transportation and communication, new networks that were emerging, and emergence of community networks which were operating at supra-local level, that is not only at local level but beyond the locality. So now this identity was going to be traced pan-India, and therefore there was going to be now a much more vocal way of demanding one's rights, because this supra-local identities were going to operate on a much larger scale as compared to the earlier times. So therefore, some other important developments that were going to help in this supra-local identity formation was the urbanization, and how there was migration from rural areas to urban areas in search of occupation, jobs, etc., and also emergence of newer occupations. All this undermined and questioned the traditional economic basis of jati rankings. So therefore, those who had been ascribed a lower jati rank were no longer ready to accept that ranking, because they had now pan-India networks. They were able to communicate across the locality, and this new regional power base was definitely going to be a very important power center, and it was going to motivate them and also give them much more confidence in order to mobilize themselves and demand for greater rights and privileges for themselves, as well as a better ritual status in the Varna hierarchy. Now, coming to the notion of caste and nationalism, this again is a very important and interesting way of understanding the changes that came about during the course of Indian history. So therefore, with the emergence of national movement and with the establishment of Indian National Congress from 1885 onwards, there was no looking back as far as the national struggle for independence was concerned. But the problem here was that even though in 1885 an All India National Party had been formed through Indian National Congress, and in fact the beginnings had been made much earlier, as there were a number of pan-Indian associations that were being formed from 1870s, 1880s onwards, and ultimately all of them culminated into this grand party. But then here the question that arises, that who were the members, to which caste they belonged, all those leaders that one can talk of during the initial years of nationalism, and even till if one talks about the moderate phase or the extremist phase, and even if one talks about the coming in of Mahatma Gandhi and emergence of mass mobilization, if one asks a question, who were the leaders and from which background they came, the answer invariably would be that most of these leaders were belonging to the upper caste and class of the society, and they were invariably upper caste men who imagined nation in their own terms. So therefore, this whole imagination of freedom, this whole project of nationalism was not something that was being carried forward or that was being visualized by different castes of Indian society. It was again a project that had largely been appropriated by particular sections of the society, and most of the secular or liberal, the so-called secular and liberal intellectuals and nationalists of the late 19th century and early 20th century belonged to the Brahmin caste, and their vision was challenged in the 19th century, however, by leaders like Jyotiba Phule, and in 20th century by a variety of non-Brahmin movements which were committed, which were wholly solely committed to overthrowing the caste system altogether. But again, that remained at the level of struggle, and what continued was the dominance of the upper caste men. Now here an interesting reference can also be made to some nationalist leaders and how there was a difference in their approach to dealing with the issue of caste system. So for example, if we talk about leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Bhimrao Ambedkar, now talking about Mahatma Gandhi, the very core ideology of Gandhi's philosophy was the idea of Varnashram Dharam. And he considered Varnashram Dharam, that is society being divided into 4 Varnas and each Varna performing their own duties religiously without questioning the other, and the only way there could be harmony and peace in society was through the fulfillment of the Varnashram Dharma, and only through this a harmonious system of interdependence could be accomplished, which only could result in a true kind of a Swaraj. This was his philosophy. But he also criticized the principle of untouchability and termed untouchables as Harijans, that is children of God. But then again there was a lot of patronizing attitude in this whole philosophy that the upper castes should assume this responsibility of considering the downtrodden as children of God, and without really questioning the existence or continuation of the Varna order, because the Varna system in itself was exploitative. It was based on this indifferent attitudes towards the marginalized sections of society. So without questioning that, without questioning the moral fabric of working of the Varna system, the idea of considering untouchability as basically wrong and morally questionable was not really going to lead anywhere. Then on the other hand, if we talk about Ambedkar, Ambedkar found Mahatma Gandhi and some other elite nationalists' representations to be very patronizing. And Ambedkar in fact wanted to end the caste system rather than reform it. So therefore, there was a major difference between the ideological stand that had been taken up by these two leaders. So therefore, a very important way of bringing about change in society according to Ambedkar was a complete annihilation of caste. There was going to be no recognition to the caste system whatsoever, and also to organize the downtrodden, politically, and he termed them Dalits, not as Harijans but as Dalits, a term which acknowledges that they had been oppressed. So the very acknowledgement that there was a particular section in Indian society which had remained oppressed, which had remained broken, their backs had been broken due to centuries of exploitation and due to they are not being given what was due to them, and acknowledging that they were oppressed, and this is the whole concept of Dalit that needs to be understood from that perspective. Therefore, this kind of understanding was going to also influence India's constitution. And when India became free after 1947, and when there was an attempt to kind of rewrite India's past, and there was an attempt to question the evil system that had been prevalent, Ambedkar played a very important role in this whole process. So the constitution that was framed in 1950, it was the single most far-reaching and revolutionary change, one single more far-reaching and revolutionary change that can be associated with the constitution was that it acknowledged equality of all citizens, irrespective of their caste, color, creed, religion, or whatsoever. So therefore, Ambedkar played a very important role in shaping the draft and in outlining the principle of equality as a matter of right, and not as some kind of a service that was going to be done to the downtrodden by the upper caste by giving them that equality. So another important development was the adoption of affirmative policies, that is the policies of reservations for Dalits, because they had been oppressed for so long. So therefore, they needed a kind of a helping hand, a boost, some kind of a boost was definitely needed in order to bring them to the level of parity. So therefore, only talking about equality was not important. What was equally important was the principle of equity, and it was this principle of equity that demanded affirmative action, that is reservations, and this was being done to compensate for the historically enforced deprivation that had been thrust on the Dalits for so long. So as products of colonialism, most liberals saw caste as a sign of backwardness. Now, a number of liberal leaders and the forward-looking elements of Indian society, rather than acknowledging caste system as highly regressive, they kind of adopted an attitude which was going to, overlook this problem, and they started imagining that probably if modernization would happen, if poverty would be eradicated over a period of time, and if the country follows the path of development and it is no longer under the colonial rule, then gradually caste discrimination will also end. So there was no real reason as to why there should be panic as far as caste system was concerned. And as upper caste men themselves, they never faced the inequities of caste discrimination. So probably most of the liberal leaders of the newly independent Indian state, since they had not themselves gone through that phase of discrimination, they were not really able to understand the problems that were there and how the underprivileged sections of society, they had spent their lives in deprivation, and the principle of equity would not be established merely by constitutionally promulgating the principle of equality without taking some active measures. They hoped that caste would simply disappear with modernization through electoral politics, and they demanded more and more inclusion of the lower caste groups in the political process, again without questioning the very basis of caste system. However, the barriers between the subcastes weakened in due course of time during 20th century, and this was definitely a welcome change. And the Indian Constitution of 1950 proclaimed the principle of equality to all citizens irrespective of caste differences and abolished the practice of untouchability, which was declared as unlawful and punishable under the law. Now, here an interesting discussion can also be undertaken as far as Ambedkar and Nehru were concerned, both very important leaders of independent India. However, there were some commonalities also in their approach. Both were committed to the cause of social justice and creating a level playing field for all Indians. So, there is no questioning that basic premise as far as both the leaders are concerned, but Ambedkar was very clear from the outset that caste needed to be tackled head on as a major problem that exists in Indian society, and he was of the opinion that if still we continue to ignore caste system as an evil practice in the hope that it would appear after modernization of the country, then we would never really be able to help the downtrodden, because unless and until we recognize the system as being a problem in the first place, nothing would be achieved. However, there was disagreement also over the Hindu Code Bill. While Nehru never questioned Hindu Code Bill, Ambedkar was always questioning it, and he was quite instrumental in demanding for inter-caste marriage, divorce, and equal rights for wives, sisters, and daughters of a Hindu family. So, these were some path-breaking differences that were there, which gradually emerged due to different attitudes and perceptions. Now, if we consider Ambedkar's contribution as the father of Indian Constitution and to the cause of eradication of inequality, a major slogan that Ambedkar had given way back in 1932, when India was still fighting, still struggling for independence, a major statement that was made by him was, "Our fight is to claim our basic human right and dignity." So, therefore, without really entering into the politics of caste system, he just talked about, he was emphatic in declaring the significance of human rights and dignity, which definitely had not been granted to the marginalized sections of society. And another very important value addition that he did for Dalits was that he gave this slogan, "Educate, organize and agitate." So, therefore, without education, there was going to be no organization, and unless and until there was an organization, there could not be a well drafted agitation, and only through agitation could Dalits really be able to achieve equality for themselves and also achieve human dignity. So, with this I would like to end today's lecture. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this session. Friends, you are requested to write to us at info.cec@nic.in. This is the ID where you can post your questions as well as your feedback for the lecture too. Friends, if you wish to see more of our lectures, the previous lectures, then you can just log on our YouTube channel where you can see all the lectures pertaining to the series and the other series too. This lecture is also going to be uploaded soon. You are requested to see us the number of times you wanted, and yes, write to us anytime you wanted. Today we are taking your leave with the promise that we would be meeting again soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you once again.
Thank you.